All right, hi everybody. We'll go ahead and get started today. Coffee and cookies, very nice. Okay, so I would like to start, of course, by acknowledging the land that we are on today in order to work and live within this region, and to thank and appreciate and recognize Indigenous peoples and communities that came before us and are here with us, and that we are continuing to grow together. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Joshua Gus Skorburg. Dr. Skorburg is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at Guelph. He's also the co-academic director for the Center for Advancing Responsible and Ethical Artificial Intelligence, CARE AI, which is a center here on campus, as well as, let's see, what else? Affiliated faculty of the One Health Institute. Guelph is Gus is originally, he did his PhD at the University of Oregon, and then a teaching position at Duke University, is that correct? And I read somewhere that you were in the news. You had a brief stint in television news, which when you meet him does not surprise you. I like it. And so today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Skorburg speak to us. And another highlight of this session is that it's a combination of bioinformatics, expertise and interests. And then we also have our Insert Create Evolution of Fungal Pathogens seminar series as well. And so I welcome students from both of those programs, as well as the rest of our audience. We have quite a healthy audience online as well. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, raise your hand at the end. So Dr. Skorburg will have his seminar. We'll then end the seminar, and then we have an informal quality assurance Q&A, question and answer period. Not too many grants. I know, too many grants. Not quality assurance, question and answer period afterwards with the graduate students. And I believe Mary Adavier, are you hosting that? That's wonderful. And so you're welcome to stay for that as well. Okay, and with that, I will let you go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming virtually and in person. So what I'll do is, I should mention at the outset that I have to go teach my graduate seminar on AI ethics right after this. So I need to wrap up about 10 minutes early, but I still want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So what I'll do is just give a whirlwind tour of my kind of high-level overview of what I think are the 6 most important ethical issues to consider. As a society, we become more and more reliant on artificial intelligence and machine learning systems. So it's meant to be a sort of big picture talk, but I'll sprinkle it in with examples that I think will be especially relevant to folks working in bioinformatics and sort of using various data-intensive technologies for health outcomes more generally. So if you paid attention to the news at all, in the last 6 months, you will have seen sort of very famous and high-profile calls for things to, pause the development of AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. You will have seen, the Center for AI Safety talking about, the need to mitigate the existential risks posed by artificial intelligence, treat them on a par with things like we treat pandemics, nuclear weapons. And so while I do think that these issues are important and worthwhile, and I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A, in this talk, I'm going to take a little bit of a step back away from these big picture existential risk, borderline sci-fi considerations about runaway AI stealing our nuclear arsenal or things like that, and talk a little bit more on the ground about why ethics matters for the development of AI tools that we use in our day-to-day lives and that are more and more likely to be used in various clinical and health contexts, right? So why talk about AI ethics at all? Well, if I'm sitting on the airplane next to someone and I tell them, oh, I'm a philosophy professor, they usually do one of 2 things, right? Everyone loves that reference from The Matrix with the spoon. They're like, is there a spoon? I'm like, yeah, there's a spoon, right? So I'll tell them that, and they say, okay, what do you do? I say, oh, I teach ethics. And they say, wow, well, what's that about? And if you have to tell someone, in a sentence what it's about, ethics is the discipline within philosophy that studies what are the properties of a good, admirable life? Like what goes into a human life that goes well? What are the properties of people who we admire? And so I think that the reason that we have to talk about and think about AI and ethics together is that it is pretty much impossible in the 21st century to talk about what goes into living a good life without thinking about technologies like AI and machine learning. So to illustrate that, let me just ask you to sort of reflect for a moment on what you think some of the most important life decisions are that you've made so far, or that you're likely to make in the next, year or two. So are there any kind of off the cuff ideas, some of the most important decisions you've recently had to make or will likely make in the next year or two? Think like big picture, your whole life. Yeah. Yeah, right. Where to settle down. Okay, so for many people right here, that meant, probably going to some universities rather than others, right? So you're choosing universities, you're choosing a career path, right? So what else is involved in the sort of prototypical act of settling down? So you choose, what else?
Finding someone to settle down with.
Yeah, someone to settle down with, right? So deciding who to date, whether and when to get married, and then what do people usually do after they get married? Kids, what do they sometimes do before they have kids? They try to buy a house unless you live in Southern Ontario, in which case you dream about buying a house. All right, but that's a pretty good list, right? Of like some of the most important decisions people make, like university, buying a house, having kids, career, where to live, that sort of thing. So yeah, these are exactly like what I thought, are some of the 4 most important life decisions people make. And so what is striking about all those examples that you just gave me is that increasingly all of those decisions are mediated by algorithms powered by artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? So like admissions to universities are increasingly using large language models to assess student essays, right? Various predictive models are being used to allocate limited resources like scholarships, right? When you apply for jobs, of course, the first person to look at your resume is likely not a person at all, but some AI trained to look at keywords that are predictive of future job success. I play golf with some mortgage brokers and they say like, I don't really have a job anymore. The algorithm just tells me like, this is how much money you get. This is your interest rate. They don't have a whole lot of discretion anymore. So creditworthiness and your sort of financial risks are largely algorithmically mediated. And of course, although the trends are sort of reversing, but at least for the past, 7 or 8 years, majority of people met their eventual spouses online. Right. And so online dating is, of course, mediated through predictive patterns of what traits of individuals are likely to lead to successful relationship outcomes. Right. So what this leads me to believe is that all of the biggest decisions that we make in our lives, everything that goes into living a good human life in the 21st century, is increasingly mediated by tools powered by artificial intelligence and machine learning. So there's no way to talk about AI apart from ethics, no way to talk about ethics apart from AI. So what I want to do in this talk is give you a high-level overview of what I take to be the 6 most important issues worth considering, right? So you can think about these as sort of probes, as the acronym suggests, or sort of questions to get in the habit of asking as you interface with various tools through your day-to-day life, or maybe even through your research, right? So this is what I call the probes model. Stands for privacy, responsibility, opacity, bias, equity, and sustainability. Right, so these are the 6 issues that we'll consider in turn. So basically in the next 35 minutes or so, I'll just go through each of these, give an example, and then look forward to hearing your thoughts and discussion questions after that. Right, so the first is to start with privacy. Okay, so when I teach undergraduate courses and we get into the ethics of AI, really common sentiment among I would like to say my generation, but the fact is I'm just getting older and I'm out of touch and I'm not on TikTok, right? So a sort of common sentiment is like, well, if you don't have anything to hide, what are you so worried about? Right. So then older people like me look at, the 18, 19-year-old undergrads and say, why are you posting like all this stuff online, like your whole lives? Like, don't you care about privacy? And often they'll say, well, like if you're not doing anything weird or creepy or illegal, like who cares, right? Like if you don't have anything to hide, why does it matter so much? And so I think it's a very common intuition that people have, but I think it's deeply and profoundly mistaken. And to get you to see why that is, I'm going to give you a very uncomfortable thought experiment. So be forewarned. So imagine that you're married, and imagine that your mother-in-law never leaves your bedroom. She's just sitting in the corner of your bedroom and she never leaves. Right? Like she's just always there. Right? And so you have to ask yourself, in this scenario where your mother-in-law is always in your bedroom, you might wonder what sorts of things you're going to get up to with your spouse. Right? And unless you're like a psychopath, probably you're not going to be engaging in lots of forms of intimacy, be it physical or emotional or otherwise, right? That's just like not the sort of thing you do around your in-laws, right? And so what I'm doing here is adapting a famous thought experiment from the philosopher James Rachels. And what James Rachels says is like, if you imagine that there are third parties that are always present in your interactions, if you're like a socially normal and competent person, you're going to alter your behavior in the presence of those third parties, right? So you're just not going to engage in intimacy when you're around your in-laws. And so what the thought experiment is meant to provoke is like, well, if they're always there, then it means that you're not ever really going to be able to engage in forms of intimacy that are characteristic of like loving, healthy relationships. And so the worry is if there's third parties always there, and those third parties cause us to not engage in characteristic forms of behavior and action, then it might undermine the very possibility of even having intimate relationships, right? Because after all, what is an intimate relationship if not engaging in intimacy? And if there's third parties there that are preventing you from engaging in it, the worry is that it undermines the very possibility of having certain kinds of relationships over time. Right? So what that example is meant to show is that like there's nothing weird or illegal or creepy about that. So the value of privacy, the reason we ought to care about privacy, even if we don't have anything to hide, even if we're not doing anything weird, is that privacy is what allows us to have the kinds of relationships that go into living a good and meaningful human life. Right? So privacy is fundamentally about being able to control who has access to us. Right? Sometimes bringing people into our circle, right? Sometimes pushing them out. Like when you just tell the in-laws after 14 days over the holidays, like, oh my God, go home. Like we need our space back, right? And like if we don't have the ability to sometimes let people in and sometimes push people out, we just don't have the ability to develop certain kinds of social relationships, right? And this should be very, very clear to you when you think about how easy it is through your day-to-day life that you switch between different kinds of social scripts. Right? The way you talk to your friend is different from the way you talk to your advisor, which is different from the way you talk to your grandmother, which is different from the way you talk to your employer. Right? So all of these social relationships have schemas, or they have these like scripts for what's appropriate to interact. And so the worry is if we give up on privacy, if we give up on the ability to control what's appropriate and who to let in and who to let out at times, we like give up on the possibility of some kinds of relationships that are required to live a good human life. Right? And so the reason it's so mistaken to think about this nothing to hide argument, right, is that like we need privacy to be the kinds of social creatures that we are. Right? Now, of course, the mother-in-law is meant to be like a very provocative example, but it's not too hard to generalize or analogize from the case of the mother-in-law to like a smartphone or a smart speaker, right? Devices that are always around, third parties that are always there, right? And begin to ask like what role do those devices, what role does the possibility of third parties always listening to us do in terms of forming the kinds of relationships that we need to live good, flourishing human lives, right? So there's much more that could be said about all of that, but the main takeaway here is that like there's a value of privacy independent of whether or not you're in some weird corners of Reddit doing like creepy stuff, right? I should plug that in. And so we have reason to care about privacy, even if we're not doing weird things. All right, so let me just plug this in quickly. This is an old computer, so the battery's really tanking. All right, so that sorry for the interruptions. So I'll again, what I said in the middle of saying is like there's a lot more that could be said about all this. Happy to take questions at the end, but that's all I'm going to say about privacy for now. Okay, so the next consideration in this probes model, right? P is for privacy, R for responsibility gaps. All right, so the Future of Life Institute, was featured on that very first slide I used where they signed this campaign, stop the development of models more powerful than GPT-4. So if you had heard of the Future of Life Institute before, it was likely because of their very famous campaign to stop killer robots. Right, so they've been an organization that's really devoted to sort of severely limiting the proliferation of autonomous weapon systems. And so here again, I want to use a purposefully provocative example to highlight an ethical issue. And so here we're going to talk about responsibility. All right, so one problem raised by the possibility of killer robots is that it presents the ethical and legal system with the dilemma. Okay, and so here's how the dilemma goes. If we imagine a situation, which is, by the way, not science fiction, it characterizes our current military capabilities, that we have a drone, right, that we're going to posit can operate fully autonomously, right, which is to say it can navigate without any meaningful form of human intervention. It can identify targets without meaningful forms of human intervention, and it can issue strikes without meaningful forms of human intervention. Okay, and so we for sure have these technological capabilities now. There's some limited evidence that autonomous weapon systems have been used in theaters of war across Africa and even in Russia, Ukraine, not confirmed, but you know, this is not a like far out sci-fi scenario. This is like the world in which we live. Right. So if we have a world in which we've got a weapon system operating fully autonomously, and we imagine a scenario where that autonomous weapon mistakenly targets and kills an innocent non-combatant civilian, right? We ask, well, what happens then? Okay, what happens? And so what I want to say is that we're presented with a dilemma in this scenario. Okay, so on the one hand, it's going to be utterly unsatisfying to the family of that wrongfully killed non-combatant civilian to say, look, we're so sorry for the loss of your loved one, but don't worry, we unplugged the drone, right? We put the drone in jail. And you say, what? Like, no, you can't put a robot in jail, right? It just seems wrong. Like if you try to put the robot in jail, you're just making a mistake, right? It's just like someone's got to be responsible for this, and it can't be the robot, right? A robot's not the sort of thing that can be the proper object of punishments and sanctions. It just seems incorrect to like put the drone in jail. No one's going to be satisfied by that, right? But on the other hand, if we indeed agree by stipulation that it was operating fully autonomously, it also seems equally incorrect to try to blame a military commander, right? So in law and in the ethics, we usually say that two conditions are required to assign moral or legal responsibility, right? You have to have knowledge and you have to have control. Right? And so the whole system of liability in our law is built on the fact that people can't be held morally or legally responsible for things over which they had no control, over which they had no knowledge, or could not have been reasonably expected to have known. Right? And so the worry is if you say, well, it doesn't seem right to put the drone in jail, but it also doesn't seem right to blame a commander, right? After all, like that's the whole premise of an autonomous system, is that you give it a way to navigate, you give it a way to identify targets, but no one could have predicted how it was going to act in a given scenario, much less control it, right? Insofar as it was operating autonomously, right? So this is the dilemma, right? It seems like we either have to give up on the concept of liability in law and ethics as we know it, or we just have to throw our hands up and say, yeah, it really sucks for your family, but you know, there's nothing we can do because we can't punish the drone, but we can't punish the commander either. Right? So this is meant to be a sort of evocative, high stakes, quite literally life and death example, but the same kinds of considerations are going to apply for less high stakes domains where we rely on more and more autonomous systems. Right? So the same dynamics about responsibility gaps are going to emerge when we use, you know, bots to do financial trading and manage our investment portfolios. Right? So they're going to act and execute trades apart from meaningful forms of human control. Right? They're going to do it in a way that'll sometimes have negative outcomes. And if there's negative outcomes, we're going to ask, like, well, who are we going to blame? Right? You can't like lock up a piece of code or fine a code because it mismanaged your portfolio. But it also doesn't seem right to hold a software developer accountable because they couldn't, you know, predict or control or know how it was going to behave in a given moment. Right? So anytime that happens, there's this gap, right, between the bad action that seems like we need an account, right? We need some responsibility, but then it's not clear who the target of that responsibility ought to be. And so it sort of creates this dilemma. And so the killer robot case is meant to put that like in very, very sharp relief, but it's going to be true anytime we rely on autonomous systems without meaningful forms of human intervention or human control. When things go wrong, who's taking responsibility for it, right? So that's the idea of responsibility gaps. So again, happy to return to this during the Q&A. We'll move on to the next part of the model, the O in probes, which I'm calling opacity. Right? And so does anyone recognize the images in the back here on the slide? Yeah? Yeah, and do you remember the task specifically? Yeah, so it's from the MNIST data set, right? So this was actually the first commercially viable application of deep learning was used for handwritten digit recognition so that we could like better sort mail at the post office, right? So to have a, train a machine to be able to read people's handwriting to figure out these, this mail over here goes to that postal code, this one over here, right? And so the image in the background here, which is again kind of hard to see, it's clear on my screen, but is exactly of a sort of deconvolution of one of the output layers in the model that's distinguishing between a digit, right? Say a 6 and an 8, right? And so what I want to suggest here is that this is, the sort of well-known black box problem. The fact that like, especially deep learning methods, but lots of forms of AI and machine learning just process information very differently than humans do. Right? And so the reason this is such a problem, and I think especially in sort of health relevant domains, is that the black box nature of AI machine learning systems undermines a fundamental component of what it is to be human. Right? So humans are the only species on the planet that do what the philosopher Wilfred Sellers calls, playing the game of giving and asking for reasons. Right? And so, the example I always use to illustrate this is like, my neighbor has a dog, right? And so, when my wife comes home, the dog just like barks at her constantly. But then when I come home, the dog doesn't bark, right? And we just sort of say, well, that's just like a dog being a dog, right? Sometimes dogs bark at people, they treat people differently, and we just say, well, that's just a dog being a dog. Now, if instead it's like, their owner, like my neighbor, and they're like very cold and mean to my wife, but very warm and congenial with me, right? I might just say, well, like, why are you being so mean to my wife? Like you kind of owe me some answer or account of like why you're treating different people differently, right? And the fact is, like, we expect that of humans, we don't expect that of dogs. Right? And so when you treat different people, or when you treat the same people differently, right, we often think, well, you got to give me a reason for that. You have to give me an account of like why you're treating her so differently than you're treating me, right? That's this, giving and asking of reasons, right? It's arguably, I would argue anyway, sort of responsible for a lot of what is distinctively human, right? The sort of institutionalized practice of giving and asking for reasons. And so the worry is that black box AI and machine learning systems are going to fundamentally undermine the ability to give and ask for reasons, right? And that's because when we look at the way that these systems process information and generate outputs, they do it in a way that is utterly unconcerned with human comprehension, right? So, these could be images of layers in a network that are used to discriminate between a 6-digit and an 8-digit. Right? And these networks are trained to quite simply minimize their loss function, right? To get as good as possible at predicting, the presence of different digits on some handwritten piece of paper, right? They don't do that in a way that tries to become explainable to us or that we can use human semantic terms to capture, right? It's in a way that's just utterly divorced from that. Right? And so what we know is like, if we can give people in like psychophysics experiments, we can like put digits on a screen and we can make them blurry. Right? And then we can use eye tracking to figure out what precise parts of the image are the humans keying in on to try to figure out, is that a 6 or is that an 8? Right? And that's a very, very different set of features than a convolutional neural network is going to use to distinguish a 6 from an 8. Right? And so the worry about that is that this very same ability that gives AI and machine learning systems the ability to achieve superhuman performance on many tasks is also going to make them incapable of giving reasons in the way that we recognize as reasons. Right? They're not able to give justifications in the way we recognize as justifications. And so the black box nature of these systems is one that undermines us, the sort of core and fundamental practice of human sociality, right? Namely this game of giving and asking for reasons. Right? So again, happy to talk more about that black box problem or the data set or the arguments therefrom. But now I want to move on to the B in the prose model for bias. Okay, so here I'm just going to reproduce an example from some of my favorite philosophers, Sina Fazlpour and Dave Danks. And so, we often hear about the phrase garbage in, garbage out, right? You train a predictive system on historically biased data, it's going to learn those bias associations. And for sure, that's right. That's a persistent source of inequality, bias, and prejudice in any domain where we're using predictive systems. So like, no doubt about that. What I want to do, though, is call attention to a prior step that I think is often not appreciated as much, right? And so this is what they call the way in which bias can enter into problem specification, right? So anytime we're engaged in a task of prediction, right, and so much of contemporary artificial intelligence and machine learning is about making problems in ways that turn them into prediction problems. Anytime we're using past data to predict a future state, right, we have to choose a target variable to predict. Right? And the fact of the matter is, there's no objective, value-free way to select a target variable to predict. Okay, so the example used in this paper is thinking about like an admissions office at a university, right? And they might well say, we want to build a predictive model for student success. Right, so we want to be able to predict on the basis of a bunch of features what leads to student success, so that we can perhaps, target our resources to those students who are most in need. Right? And so that sounds totally reasonable, and admissions offices all over the country are doing exactly this sort of thing. But how do you define student success? And I think what should be clear, if you think about it for a second, is that there are lots of reasonable ways you might operationalize the target variable of student success. Right? It could be GPA. You could look, post-graduation and say, what's the salary? You could look post-graduation and say, what's their satisfaction with life, right? You could look at, any number of these features seem like they would be good proxies or stand-ins for the thing we care about, namely student success. Right? So one of the areas where I think this is sort of most interesting and important is precisely in the health domain, right? So if you want to use any kind of predictive modeling to predict a health outcome, right, you got to be pretty clear, well, what do you mean by health? Right, so is health, something that's accurately captured and quantified by lab results, subjective satisfaction, followers on Instagram, right? Like all of these could be reasonable stand-ins for that metric, but there's just no objective way to go about figuring out what's the right target variable to use for our prediction problem. Right? And so once we recognize that, then you can see the ways in which bias can creep in even before we're at like the training stage for a model. Right, just the very way we define the problem can have certain forms of bias, right? So if we operationalize student success in terms of post-graduation salary, right, we're likely going to be biased towards those fields that produce, more immediate short-term gains in income over those fields that produce less gains in income, right? So the very way you set up the problem is one in which the solutions to that problem are going to be determined, and the values of the person doing the modeling can enter in. Right? So that's just, I think, a sort of underappreciated way in which bias can enter into these automated systems. Right? Of course, bias can be in the data in the familiar forms of garbage in, garbage out. Bias can enter into the picture when we're actually doing modeling or validation of a model. Right? So there's a huge ongoing literature about like what would it mean for a machine learning system to be fair. Right? So is it that we should have the same error rates across groups? Or should it be that the predictions being made are tracking the same features regardless of membership in groups, right? There's no obvious or correct answer to this question, right? One famous paper from 2018, identifies 24 different definitions of fairness in the AI ethics literature, right? All of which are defensible, right? Almost all of which are reasonable. And so all of these are just sort of levels at which bias can enter into the development and deployment of automated systems. Right, so happy to talk more about that, but we'll move on to the E in the model, right? I'm calling equity. And so here, I think the sort of health domain provides some of the best examples, right? So when we think about deploying automated systems, we should always be in the habit of asking, who benefits from those systems and who decides how they get deployed. Right. So one of the things that was most striking to me about the COVID-19 pandemic is the way in which, across so many health systems across the world, we were able to very quickly and rapidly and mostly effectively pivot to digital forms of healthcare delivery, right? So be it virtual visits, be it telehealth, be it various forms of mobile health and digital phenotyping, right? Like, it's often said that we made more progress in digital health in 5 days than we did in the 5 years before, right? Once the lockdowns went into effect. And so I don't want to downplay any of that, of course. But one thing that stands out to me the most is that those digital health interventions, in many ways, were ones that didn't seem to benefit the people who were most at risk from COVID-19. Right. So what was true all the way back in 2020, and we know with striking clarity today, is that the elderly are most at risk from this disease. Right. But very often these digital technologies were not developed with an eye towards those who weren't engaged in the digital economy in many ways, who weren't fluent, who might not have reliable access to broadband. Right. And so while on the one hand, this was like an amazing watershed moment for digital health, it's just very striking that like the people who were most at risk seem to be the ones who were benefiting potentially the least from the cutting edge technological developments. Right. And so the worry is when we roll out systems like that, they have the potential of increasing the divide between the so-called digital haves and the digital have-nots. Right. So a lot of the digital phenotyping methods, work really well if you've got, a smartwatch that can track your heart rate variability, that can track your location, that can track all sorts of biometric features, that can be linked up with social media to track, your social networks, that can be linked up with your electronic health records, right? We can deliver some pretty fine-grained predictions about health outcomes when we've got all those multimodal sources of data, right? But of course, they presume things like having a smartwatch, being on social media, having a reliable broadband connection. And what we know in Canada and across the world is that those over 65 are among the least likely members of the population to have reliable access to broadband and to be using a lot of these devices that are increasingly being deployed as sort of measures, but also predictors for various outcomes, right? And so the sort of worry here, the kind of bigger picture worry that I have is that while there are certainly many benefits to these digital approaches to health, and this is going to combine with the previous remarks on bias, is that like the more we lean into that, the bigger the risk we run potentially of forgetting that we're actually dealing with people, right? And instead thinking about like data points or vectors in the space of data. Right. So as we get more and more multimodal data from sources relevant to health, and we build more and more sophisticated models of parsing that data and generating predictions about health outcomes, I sort of worry that like we forget that the practice of sort of medicine generally and those working in the sort of health and caring professions, right, is fundamentally about people. Right. It's not about data. It's about making people's lives go better. It's about making them function more. And I worry about our ability to do that when we stop thinking about people as people and start thinking about them more like data points. Right, so I think that's sort of unifying way to connect some of the last two considerations. Okay, so the last consideration here in the model is what I'm calling sustainability for S, so sustainability and the hidden environmental and human costs. So it's very easy now to read reporting and read things in the news about AI and to just think like, computation happens in the cloud. Right, you type in your query to Chat GPT, it goes in the cloud, you get a prompt, and it's like this very ephemeral thing, right? It's just like out there in the ether somewhere, right? But of course, these are very physical systems that require lots of electricity to run and lots of water to be cooled. Okay, so this is like a hilariously out of date and almost cute image, right? From I think this was a 2018 paper showing the common carbon footprints of various activities, right? So you'll notice this last bar here, right, is describing a transformer architecture with 213 million parameters. And of course, we now know that we're running language models, hundreds of companies running hundreds of language models, many orders of magnitude greater than this. Right, so by most estimates, GPT-4 is a model with 1 trillion parameters. Right, and so you can see that like there is a demonstrable electrical footprint required to both train these models and to run them at inference time. Right, so a lot of this, the companies sort of keep their cards very close to their chest, but one recent estimate suggests that as far as we can sort of reverse engineer this, that a single so the electricity required to respond to a single prompt in GPT-4 Turbo, like the latest version, requires as much electricity and inference time as is required to charge your phone, right? So a single prompt in ChatGPT is about as much electricity as a phone charge. You think about how many people issuing how many prompts every day that are required for for these machines to run that. Like it's this sort of a non-trivial thing, right? All of a sudden, it doesn't seem like the cloud anymore. It seems like, oh yeah, this is like the electrical output of a country the size of like Switzerland, right? By some estimates. All right. So while we think about these things as cloud devices and cloud computations, they're physical systems, right? They obey the laws of physics and they require electricity to train and run. Right. The server farms require massive amounts of water to cool the machines as well. Importantly, there's also a ton of human labor that goes into annotating and labeling the training data sets, which also gets sort of erased in this view of AIs being independent. Right. So this is just a reminder that like these are physical systems that require limited physical resources to run and that are often propped up and supported by underappreciated and underpaid forms of human labor. Right? What I want to conclude with is a sort of meta question, right, about the ethics of AI. And so how I want to do this is to get you to consider a rule. Right, so pretty much every culture that has been studied by anthropologists has some version of this rule: don't harm innocent people. Okay, now of course cultures will have massive variation on who counts as innocent, but pretty much every culture has the rule: don't harm innocent people. Okay, so one thing that's striking about this rule is that it seems to hold equally well in the Stone Age, when the primary way we might harm someone is by throwing a rock at them. But notice that the same rule applies equally well in the age of smart firearms, nuclear weapons, and biological weapons. Right? Like even though we have like amazing technological capabilities, the baseline rule, like don't harm innocent people, still applies, whether you're talking about rocks or nuclear weapons. Right? So that's an example of like a sort of ethical rule or system that just seems to apply the same way, even in the face of rapid and massive technological change. So it's true whether we're talking about rocks or whether we're talking about firearms. Right now, consider the difference between broadcast advertising and targeted advertising. Right, so if you look at like the codes of ethics and the codes of conduct in like 1950s and 60s era marketing, you know, there's this common assumption that like when you bought an ad, then you would buy an ad for a market. Right, so you might buy an ad, so you want to sell a pair of shoes, right? So that everyone who is in Guelph watching Hockey Night in Canada is going to see the same ad, right? And so everyone who's around the TV at that time sees the same ad, and like the practices and the ethics and the regulation around the discipline had to assume that. But what's striking today is that like I'm still a cheap grad student in many ways. So like I use my old grad school ID to get a cheaper New York Times subscription, right? And then even worse than that, like I let my wife use it. So it's like two people on the same one. And what's amazing now is like even on the same account, right? So she's like free riding off of my account. So on the very same New York Times account, we can sit down on the couch next to each other and open the app and see different ads and different headlines on the same, like the same news source sitting in the same house on the very same account, right? Advertisers are still able to target ads because they know it's like her version of the New York Times rather than mine, right? So that's a very different world than the one where you buy an ad and everyone in Guelph sees the same ad, right? So that to me seems like an area where like whatever the laws and rules and regulations were for like broadcast media back then, they're just out of touch, they're out of date, and they're not going to be up to the task of figuring out how we regulate advertising in a world where you can literally target two people sitting on the same couch with different ads, right? It just seems like we need a new system to catch up with those new capabilities in the way the old broadcast systems are just like going to be unable to do, right? They'll be outdated. So the big meta question is like, are the credible applications of AI and machine learning more like the first one or the second one? So when we're thinking about the ethics of AI, is it more like the rocks and the firearm example where the same rule applies even in the face of massive technological change? Or is it instead more like the advertising example where like we clearly need these new rules, these new regulations, because the old way of regulating it is just out of date with the current technological capabilities, right? And so if you think the latter, and I'm inclined to think that probably most people do recognize that AI allows us to do things we couldn't do before, most of our outdated ways of regulation and ethics in the law are sort of outdated for it. If you think it's more like that second example, then there's this big question of like, well, who should be doing the regulating, right? Who does the regulating? And so my sort of closing plea is basically to say, well, it should be the people like you who are in this classroom who understand at least something about how these systems are being built and deployed, right? Because if it's not you, then who else is it going to be? Okay, so that's an overview of the probes model. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions. And references are here too. Happy to share slides if you folks would like.
years in AI space, like Session, trying to pull the ladder up, and it's beneficial to them to kind of encourage legislation that wasn't there when they were developing their models, encourage that onto competitors and somewhat restrict them. Do you think it lends credence to people who may more genuinely believe in sort of regulating AI, or does it undermine?
The sort of cynical worry, for those who might not be familiar with the like kicking out the ladder phrase, is basically like, it's a very common strategy throughout the history of business that like when one effective way for a company in a leading position to consolidate their power is to be the one to introduce regulation that cements their status as like having a large market share and handicaps or prevents other companies from entering the space, right? And so a lot of people look at, Sam Altman's going on his little world tour to governments of the world saying, we need to regulate AI very cynically, right? Saying like, well, this is just a ploy to lock in their market share. And so I think that there's lots of good historical evidence of companies doing this. I don't see any reason why this would be different from that trend. And so like one of the biggest problems that I have with that view is that, my view is very much that people who are impacted by the technology should have a say in how it's developed and how it's regulated, right? And so one of the major problems with letting, only the companies self-regulate is that the people who are affected by their technologies effectively have no say in the rules that they're going to play by. So it just seems to me to be a very plausible assumption, like in general, if something might affect you, you should have a say in it. And so that's where I find this sort of that's where I'm sort of dissatisfied with the like, don't worry, let us regulate ourselves. So it's like, well, what about the people who are going to be, out of a job or whose lives are going to significantly change as a result of these technologies, right? In my view, I don't know if they're the ones leading the conversation, but they at least have to have a seat at the table, right? And very often they're not given a seat at the table. Yeah. In biology.
I know with like Tesla has like a
Yeah.
case going on with like self-driving and stuff.
Yeah, well, so that's it, right? So there's never been a case that has gone to trial with a sort of adverse event with a self-driving vehicle, right? So they've all been settled out of court. So every year Stanford hosts a conference called iRobot, and they have mock trials, right, for how they think these things might go. When some family refuses to take a massive settlement from Uber or Tesla when their loved one was killed in an autonomous vehicle accident. But the fact is, we just don't know yet, right? We don't know how liability will be assigned or apportioned because they've all been settled out of court. And so, I'm trained as a philosopher, not a lawyer, so I kind of read this stuff recreationally. I don't know how it goes, but I do know that there are like massive, massive changes coming to the insurance regime, for example. So that's sort of a more practical on the ground way to think about liability is like, who's at fault for the accident? That doesn't involve, complicated questions about settling out of court and things like that. And so it's interesting, right, that a lot of the sort of rumors and stuff that's even confirmed now is that companies like Tesla and Mercedes-Benz appear prepared to offer their own insurance to people who purchase their cars because they're confident enough in the sort of autonomous operation. And so the idea of getting insurance, not from a third party, but from the provider of the vehicle itself, that's a big shift to the way we usually think about insurance and insurance markets. And so it's anyone's guess, right? Like there's lots of speculation, but in short, we just don't know. With the case of AVs, automated vehicles. And so unfortunately, I wish I had a better example that comes to mind that's more relevant to the biology domain, but it's like autonomous vehicles are the ones that everyone goes to.
This question is not mine. I heard it from Elon Musk during an interview.
Sure.
So he was asking himself about like humans, we have been able to evolve and develop thanks to our intelligence,
Mhm.
our ability to overcome
Mhm.
problems, and our higher intelligence compared to other animals.
Mhm.
So he said, what if something else is more intelligent than us?
Yeah.
It's gonna be a problem. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts?
Well, so I teach, philosophy of mind class every year, and we always talk about like, can AI be conscious? What does it mean for AI to be intelligent? And one thing I feel extremely confidently about is that there is only one correct answer to that question. And do you think you know what it is? No, but, right. So I'm joking. So the only correct answer to that question is depends on what you mean by intelligence. Right? That is the only sensible way to answer that question. And so if by intelligence you mean, making novel inferences, then sure, like there's lots of contemporary large language models that are outperforming most human reasoners, right? But if you mean, collaborating to solve social problems, like we don't see a whole lot of these multi-agent reinforcement learning systems producing cooperative behavior on the scale that we get with humans. Right. So it's sort of an annoying philosopher thing to say is to nitpick, well, it depends what you mean by intelligence, but I think that's actually right. And I think that the entire debate about whether we have AGI, whether, we'll ever be surpassed, it's a semantic debate. It just depends on what you mean by intelligence. And there's no, again, fixed sort of definition of that. So what you have to do in that case is you have to sort of lay out your assumptions about what definition of intelligence you want to work with, such that a machine is surpassing human or falling short or whatever. So you have to lay out those assumptions. You have to defend them, right? So it's just intellectually lazy to say what's going to happen when we have AI that's more intelligent than humans. Well, it's like you owe me a story of what intelligence is and why that's the right story to tell, right? And so I think that's what a lot of the sort of stuff you read about in the news about AI taking jobs and stuff and being intelligent. It's just like you got to say what you mean and you have to defend why that's the right way to think about it. And I see like I don't see enough of that. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And so that's the kind of work that I think is much more useful. Right. So there's, so DeepMind is probably the group most famously having done this 2 or 3 months ago, putting out a paper where they talk about, I think, 4 or 5 levels of what's required for AGI. And so, my view on that is like, great, that's one, it doesn't settle it once and for all, but at least it gives us a way to have a principled debate about it, right? To make sure we're not just kind of talking past each other. So the DeepMind paper from, if you can, I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but if you look at like DeepMind definition of AGI, that's one of the best and most recent and most newsworthy examples of this that I've seen.
Yeah. Personally for you, are you more of an optimist or pessimist with the future development of AI?
There's only one correct, depends what you mean by optimism, depends what you mean by pessimism.
It's like with integrating into our society.
Yeah. Well, look, so I'll give you an interesting example of an optimistic argument. I don't know if I believe it, but it's one that I've read recently, right? Which is like, if you look at like in the medical domain, the sorts of things that AI is really, really good at, it does seem like there's a pretty good overlap between the skill set of medical AIs and the skill set that we generally associate with like higher paid, higher prestige professions like doctors, right? So making diagnoses, right? So incorporating lots of different multimodal data to deliver a diagnosis, right? That's the sort of thing that like I have no doubt that large language models are going to very soon, if not already, surpass many human clinicians in. Just the ability to incorporate massive amounts of information in a short amount of time just exceeds what humans can do. So what's interesting is if you buy that, right, then all of a sudden it might look like the traditional gender imbalance we see in the medical profession, with like doctors making significantly more money than nurses, right, where the nursing profession tends to be dominated by women. It may look like in the face of the development of large language models that there becomes a premium on the sort of caring labor traditionally provided by nurses, right? That the sort of things that nurses do aren't as easily automated away as the things that doctors do. So there's some optimism to say, well, actually, like the skills of these models might be one that could go some way towards increasing some gender imbalances that we've seen in medicine. Now, I don't know if I believe that, but that's an optimistic argument, right? That instead of making the disparities worse and the biases worse, as we often hear about, like maybe it's actually poised to put a premium on caring labor traditionally done by women in a way that is not easily or maybe even ever automatable in the way that a lot of the intellectual tasks that we associate with higher prestige, higher paying professions are, right? So that would be an example of an optimistic argument. And then I don't know, I guess there's no sort of shortage of pessimistic ones, right? Like they get the nuclear codes, right? They like take over the financial system and hold us all hostage, or like, the one I worry about is like deepfakes. Right. So I don't know if there's any science fiction fans in the room, but like Neil Stephenson's latest book, Termination Shock, imagines what I take to be like the utterly worst case scenario, right? So he imagines a case where the prime minister of the Netherlands comes on TV and says, the seawall has been breached. So if you've ever been to the Netherlands, right, if the seawall gets breached, like they're in a bad way. The whole, country is held in by seawalls. So the prime minister comes on and says, there's been a terrorist attack. The seawall has been breached. Everyone evacuate, right? And then 2 minutes later, a perfectly identical prime minister comes on the air and says, that was all a deep fake. There's no terrorist attack, right? And then sort of, you can imagine the social chaos that ensues about like, who do we trust? Was there not? Do I go? Do I stay? Right? That's the stuff that I think is pessimistic. And the fact that these models are open source, available to anyone with an internet connection, that's the sort of pessimistic side, and that is what does keep me up at night. Yeah.
We have a question online. Should the patient be informed when the doctor is using AI as a tool for clinical examination? And what will be collected as personal information?
Yeah, awesome. So it's a great question. And there was a recent paper in the American Journal of Bioethics, which argued precisely for this new right, that patients should have a right to know if they're dealing with an AI versus a human doctor. So we currently don't have any regulation or laws or even best practices or guidelines around that. But I think that as you hear more rumblings about, using AI to make sort of triage decisions or to sort of, divert phone calls, right, to hotlines or helplines, it does seem reasonable that the end users of that should have a right to know if they're dealing with an AI or with a human. And so one of the things that I find super interesting in that domain is, so presumably all of you know that we have access to Microsoft Copilot through our U of G subscription, right? So it's like running the latest version of GPT-4. And one of the things that's really notable is how non-human it is, right? Like there's no personification whatsoever. It's like this abstract logo. It very rarely uses like first personal pronouns in the way ChatGPT did, especially when it was first released, right? Even the name of it, right? Copilot is one that suggests it's like not an agent. It's just like a thing that's there that helps you. And so it's an interesting area to keep an eye on, right? And so I think the idea is like, it appears to me from the outside, like Microsoft made this very conscious choice in branding Copilot to make it like not human and make it totally obvious you're dealing with an AI and like go to great lengths to make sure you're not confused that there's some like ghost in the machine, right? But of course, there's like lots of other applications where it goes in the opposite direction, right? You try to personify, you can embody it in robots, right? And so I think that being clear and transparent and honest about that is going to be increasingly important as these lines get more and more blurred. So thanks for sharing that.
So looking at the things AI is doing and looking at technology advancement, as students, what can we do? Because the reason why most of us are here is to be able to fit in positions as a school to be able to increase our employment rate. But since AI is doing most of the things that we as students can do, how prepared can we be so that as a school we'll be able to get employment in companies?
Yeah, because like, I mean, there is this worry that is often associated with like the millennial generation, like my generation, which is like everything that we, is supposedly valuable we learned at university is like now being done by large language models. So first of all, I think a lot of those are overblown, right? And so I think what a lot of the very good and careful economic studies that are looking at like technological displacement and automation and stuff were brought by AI, there's a lot of disagreement in that field, but one thing that they agree upon is that it almost never makes sense to talk about AI taking people's jobs, right? Much less people's job categories, like the category of secretary is no, no, there's no historical evidence for that claim whatsoever. What is much more likely is that AI will automate tasks within jobs, right? And so I think the way to think about that question is like, what parts of the job are going to be more amenable to automation by AI? But the fact is, like, AIs, like, they're going to be beneficial for science, but they can't do science, right? Like AI by itself can't do science. It doesn't have a desire for the truth or for knowledge, right? I mean, so the whole problem of hallucinations of AIs making stuff up can be regarded as just a total disregard for truth versus falsity. And so until there's some sense of like truth seeking, like to do science, we have to have humans. Like there is no science without humans. So I think the productive way of framing that is like, what parts of jobs are likely to be automated? And so it's true, right? Like lots of lots of code writing now. You know, the kind of stuff that I learned to do in grad school, like, yeah, Copilot's just going to do that. It's totally like no one's ever going to hire someone to do that again. But there's still lots of other things that are relevant, that there's a premium on the human labor that can't be automated away. So it's just like, it's a sort of plea to be like a bit more fine-grained in our thinking about it, right? Like not automating jobs, but automating tasks within jobs. It's a great question. So I know, do we need to like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
so with that, I want to thank Dr. Skorburg. Thank you very much. That will conclude the seminar portion, and then if the graduate students would like to stay for a Q&A for about 20 minutes, please do. We've got Teams set up on your computer, so keep that there. And otherwise, thank you everybody for coming.